Death is very much something that we're all insulated against in the modern world. It doesn't. We don't make a song and dance about it. Generally speaking, most people, when a loved member of the family dies, it's all handled very discreetly. Teams of professionals come and take away the body very soon after death, and really, and then the body is never really seen again. A coffin appears at a crematorium or in a church for a service, and then it's all spirited away, and it happens very, very quietly. But what happened in the aftermath of Queen Elizabeth's death was quite different. Also, quite simply, the last photographs of her, where she was meeting Liz Truss, the new leader of the Conservative Party in Britain, and therefore the Prime Minister of the government. In hindsight, you could see that there was bruising on Elizabeth's hands. She was evidently and visibly an elderly lady coming to the end of life. We know that now, of course, but you can see it when you look back at the photographs. And then the fact that her coffin was taken on procession from Balmoral, where she died, and the car, the hearse brought the coffin on a long tour through Scotland, and people turned out to line the route. Farmers lined up their tractors as one manifestation of a guard of honour along part of the route. And then when she came to Edinburgh, and the coffin was taken up the Royal Mile, the High Street in Edinburgh, and then brought into St Giles Cathedral, the High Kirk in Edinburgh, for a lying in rest, as they called it. Apparently there's no difference between that and a lying in state, but protocol determined that it was called a lying in rest. And people came in their thousands to see the coffin. And then again, when the coffin was taken back to London, and there was the lying in state in Westminster Hall, well, apparently 250,000 people came past. And in essence, it was because all of those people, for all manner of different reasons, but they were united by wanting to pass by the coffin, to get close as they were allowed to the mortal remains of the Queen. And that's a remarkable, I think, manifestation of ancient human instinct. I'm sure for many people the Queen, apart from being the monarch of Britain, I'm sure for a lot of people she was bringing to mind other deaths in the recent past, maybe during the past 2 years, deaths that weren't where bodies were not to be got near, and funerals were non-existent, and mourners weren't allowed in to take part in those services. So I did wonder if some of what was happening around the death of the Queen was also where people were thinking about their own loved ones as well, at the same time. But it was that evident desire to be near her. It's just remarkable, and it's a reminder of our relationship with death. The Latin memento mori means something along the lines of remember that you have to die. And death is it's that inevitability. Everyone owes a death, and rather than be hidden from it, I think being confronted by a public death like that, and having the opportunity to take part in or witness all of the rituals of that death just says something. It just says something interesting, even profound, about human beings. Our relationship with the dead is so complex in many ways, but it's also I think a fascination with, or a connection to the mortal remains. It even transcends species. I mean, elephants have been witnessed innumerable times where they come across the bones or the remains of dead elephants. They evidently recognise them for what they are. They know that it's the remains of fellow travellers, and they stop and they spend time, moaning and grumbling around the bones, and they pick up the bones and they move them around and they hold them with their trunks and whatever, and they appear for all the world to be mourning, or at the very least marking the passing of fellow elephants. So that being affected by the dead it's not even strictly human. That whole spectacle of the Queen being so visible and moving through the realm, moving through the country for days, and then spending time in public buildings where people could go and see the coffin. It's powerful magic. And obviously I spent a lot of time thinking about the way in which we used to be about the dead. We know from the Neolithic period, for example, where the farmers very early on they were in the habit of building houses for the dead, tombs. They were building stone tombs for the dead before they were building stone houses for the living. Building permanent accommodation for the dead was the priority, not for the living. And those tombs remained open for generations, and bodies were laid out probably in a lot of cases until they had decomposed, picked over by animals and all the natural processes of decomposition, and then the bones were gathered up and placed into the tombs at that point in these great ossuaries, these great collections of bones. And sometimes the bones were laid out as individuals, other times the bones were they became part of that collective reservoir of the community's dead. So the long bones were all together, and the skulls were all together, and the arm bones were all together. So there was this process by which the individual became subsumed by the greater whole, became part of the ancestors. And then people were going into those tombs and taking the bones back out. So perhaps they were taking them for ceremonies, rituals. Perhaps from time to time people took home the bodies of their ancestors. Maybe they went in and got Gran, Dad, and took them home. So the point is that there was no squeamishness about the mortal remains. We tend to be very squeamish about the dead, but for the longest time our species seems to have been very up close and personal with the dead. In Skara Brae, the Neolithic village on mainland in Orkney, you'll have seen the pictures of the houses. They have these Fred and Wilma Flintstone stone furniture in the houses. The stone dresser and the stone the settings for beds laid out in stone. Obviously they would have been softened by whatever furs and bracken or whatever else, but stone bed. Well, under one of the beds in one of the houses, they found the skeletons of 2 adult women. So presumably those women had lived and died as part of a community, as part of a family within that house, and after death they were buried under the bed, and the people in the house continued. Life went on with those presumably loved bodies just under the floorboards, so to speak. A very different, intimate relationship. And times without number on archaeological excavations, bodies of human bones are found within houses, especially babies. It looks as if infants or those that died very young weren't put away. They were kept in the house, often under the kitchen floor. And it's very difficult to interpret exactly what was going on there, but maybe it was just a desire to hold those remains close. But again, it's that fascinating glimpse of intimacy with and familiarity with and an ongoing relationship with the dead. I'm always reminded too that the presence of grave goods in the graves of the ancestors clearly suggests that for the longest time there was a belief in something else, somewhere else. I think death is presumably hardest to cope with for those who believe that there is nothing else. You're born, you live, you die, and there's an end of it. That makes death very final. And if that's the way you think, that's the way you think, of course. But for the longest time, grave goods seem to suggest that many of there would have been, I suppose you would have had the equivalent of atheists amongst the ancestors who thought it was all a lot of nonsense. But the abiding culture seemed to be to prepare and to furnish the dead with things they would need in the next life. weapons and tools and food and keepsakes. And that says a lot about what you do see in the grave, in the funerary rituals of the ancestors, is that belief, seemingly closely held for thousands of years, that the dead were going somewhere out of sight, but nonetheless real. And I'm always minded to think about the mother and baby found amongst within a Mesolithic cemetery in Vedbæk, which is a suburb of modern Copenhagen in Denmark. They were building a school, a primary school, I think, in the 70s, and they came across these burials that were from the Mesolithic period, so the time before farming, the hunters, 7,000 years ago. And several of the graves contained more than one body, and sometimes adults and infants, and one particular had a young woman and an infant, and it's always been assumed that they were a mother and infant that died together in childbirth. The infant's remains are so slight, they're too small, too young even to say what sex they were, but the baby had been laid down on the wing of a swan. So someone had acquired a white swan's wing and put that in the grave beside the mother and put the baby down upon it. Now that's potent. At the very least, that's somebody presumably who didn't like the thought of the baby lying on the cold earth, cold clay, and wanted to put something down. Or it might be something to do with a belief in a relationship to the patterns of migratory birds. You know, the idea that migratory birds leave and they're gone for a while and then they come back in a repeating pattern, and maybe those people, those hunters who were watching the ways of animals around them, thought that perhaps the spirits of the dead mother and baby would come back in due time if they were associated with, you know, the wings of a swan. And the mother's body was laid down with clothes, apparently, judging by the position of her head, and there was a necklace of assembled from red deer teeth. So all sorts of care had gone into the way in which these two were put down, and what you're seeing excavated from the ground there and in other places is grief. What survives in the ground to be found by archaeologists is the residue of what those people meant to those they left behind, and it's powerful stuff. It's not until the Christian era that the tradition evolved of people going into the ground with nothing. You know, that you came from nothing and you go back to nothing, so people didn't go in with grave goods at all. But it's up until that time people did. Obviously we see it, you know, Egyptians, the pharaohs, the tombs and all the rest of it, people were going into the ground or into the hereafter equipped to cope with whatever was coming next. I mean, it's morbid stuff, isn't it, I suppose, but I'm haunted by some of the dead that I've seen, especially in some respects even the ancient dead. There's Birka girl, who was excavated from an island called Bjorko in Lake Mälaren in Sweden, which was excavated in the 19th century. And she's a little Viking girl, and her grave was in the place of highest honour in the cemetery, up in the highest ground, close to an important part of the defensive structure of the town. And she was only little, very small, no more than 6 or 7 years old. And the archaeologists were able to determine that she had been she was buried with a gilded brooch over her chest, and it could be determined that it had been pinned to fabric. And the assumption was that if she mattered that much, she would probably have been wearing an expensive dress, and the most expensive dress would have been dyed red, so it would be a little girl in a red dress. And she also had a necklace of glass beads, expensive, acquired from elsewhere, and a bone container with little bone needles in it, which were a mark of womanhood, actually, a badge of status and maturity, of having come of age. And so the fact that this little girl was buried with them seemed to be demonstrating the determination on the part of those who buried her, that when she turned up wherever she was going, that she would be able to demonstrate that she was someone of importance, someone of status. So it's again demonstrated the case that she was dressed in all her finery with the expectation that she would be going somewhere, that she would be carrying on somewhere else out of sight. And I always find these demonstrations of commitment to faith in something else that's there in the ground thousands of years ago. I find that very moving. But it all, you just come back to the fact that what people did around the death of the Queen was, it seemed to be some instinctive human response that's as old as the hills. People just wanted to be near the coffin. We're sophisticated 21st century people, but that spontaneous reaction was there. And memento mori, remember that you have to die. I think there's a great service actually in just facing up to death. Look, and it was the Queen's death, and it invited people to think about their own loved ones who had died. And there's really nothing morbid about it. I think it's hugely beneficial for people to contemplate the inevitability of death. Because we all owe a death. Mary Queen of Scots apparently had a watch which was it was like a silver skull. That was a popular theme. People kept images of skulls and bones and whatever, reminders of the inevitability of death. And Mary Queen of Scots had this watch that was a skull, and it was inscribed with lines from Horace, the Roman poet, words to the effect, "Pale death knocks with the same tempo upon the huts of the poor and the towers of kings." That whoever you are, from the poorest to the richest, from the least powerful to the most powerful, death's there, just waiting. It's just powerful. It's just powerful imagery. I think one of the most evocative I've ever heard about, and I was told about it years ago by a lecturer at university, and I don't even know if I don't know where this is supposed to have happened, and I'm not even 100% sure that it's definitely true, but it's such a good story that it's worth it. Apparently, archaeologists were excavating a Greek site, and they found an amphora, big container for olive oil and various things. And in this instance, when they took the seal off the top of it, it was full of honey. And honey being honey, it was still good, because honey doesn't go off. It's always good. And apparently the archaeologists, they started eating it. It's 2,000-year-old honey, because there was nothing wrong with it. But then they realised that later that there was something at the bottom within the honey, and in fact it was the body of an infant, perfectly preserved. So a dead baby had been put into this amphora filled with honey, and the honey had meant that the baby hadn't decomposed. It was still perfect within the honey. Now, as I say, I was just told this as an anecdote, and I can't really testify as to its veracity, but it's an amazing thought that that baby was treated in that way for who knows what reasons, who knows what that was all about. And I also noticed the funeral. The funeral was extraordinary. I mean, all the pomp and pageantry at the disposal of the British state was on full display, and it's powerful stuff. The music, the precision, the choreography of it all was very, very impressive if you saw any of it. But I also noticed that as they were going into Westminster Abbey, particularly when they were carrying in the coffin, they came past the grave of the unknown warrior, because the unknown warrior is in Westminster Abbey, and that's the body that was anonymously taken from one of the charnel houses of the First World War, Arras or the Somme, or where many men had died, and was brought to represent all of the dead. And the idea was that because he was unknown, unidentified, that every mother could contemplate the possibility that it was her son that was being treated in this way. And it's the grave of the unknown warrior, and it's a flat gravestone on the floor of Westminster Abbey, and it says, amongst other things, they buried him among kings because he had done good toward God and towards his house. And so this anonymous individual, it lies in the place of greatest honour. And it's because of the British practice during the First World War of leaving the dead where they fell, not bringing them home. It meant that millions of people had no grave to visit. You know, in the immediate aftermath of the First World War, it was a much bigger deal to try and get to the battlefields of France to see a grave than it is now. And the reality for many people was that they had no place to go to grieve. And so various attempts were made to compensate for that. It's why you get all the war memorials, 30-odd thousand war memorials around Britain. And they weren't paid for or commissioned by the government. They were paid for by individual communities who each raised funds, commissioned artists, had these statues cast or these plaques engraved, and they had them as their local war memorial. And it meant that they had somewhere they could go. For want of a grave, they could go to the statue, or they could go to the plaque and put down flowers on the birthday or the armistice day or whatever, whenever they wanted to remember the dead. And so too with the unknown warrior. Also the cenotaph. You know, that was initially commissioned from the architect Sir Edwin Lutyens as a temporary focal point for the parade. The original was made out of plasterboard, and it was only supposed to be there for the day. But so many people laid poppies and put flowers down at it that it rapidly became apparent that people wanted it to stay forever. And so it was replaced with the permanent cenotaph made of Portland stone. And it stands, amongst other things, as a gravestone for all of the dead. So it's another place that people could go to, because that desire to get close to the dead. You know, they wanted to go to the grave of their own dead, their own loved body, but they couldn't. And so all of these alternatives were come up with. They came up with all those alternatives so that people could go somewhere and take their grief somewhere and unload it. And it all comes back to people wanting to be near the dead. That human instinct to be close to the dead. And when I saw that unfolding around the Queen, that people responded instinctively, without being told, in that way, that so many people did, was profound. We are insulated from much of the reality of life and death. We just don't see it. And because we've kind of collectively taken the option not to see the reality of death, then I think we've maybe lost some connection to the reality of life at the same time.